The call came at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning. I remember because the red numbers on my bedside clock seemed to pulse with each ring of the phone. Sheriff Dawson's gruff voice crackled through the receiver. "Martha, I need you down at the Miller place. Now." In 15 years as Millfield's only social worker, I'd received plenty of early morning emergencies, but something in Jim Dawson's tone made me sit straight up. "What happened?" "Old Harold Miller's dead. Found him this morning when Mrs. Peabody called about his newspapers piling up. But that's not why I'm calling." He paused, his breath heavy through the line. "You need to see this for yourself." 30 minutes later, I pulled up to Harold Miller's dilapidated Victorian at the end of Sycamore Street. The house that had been the neighborhood eyesore for decades now sat surrounded by police tape, two cruisers parked haphazardly in the overgrown yard. Harold Miller. The man nobody in Millfield really knew, though he'd lived here for over 40 years. The town recluse with his unkempt beard and tattered clothes who shuffled down Main Street once a week for groceries, eyes fixed on the sidewalk, never speaking unless spoken to. The man children whispered about, and teenagers dared each other to approach. The neighbor everyone pretended not to see. And now, he was gone. Sheriff Dawson met me at the porch steps, his weathered face unusually pale. "Prepared yourself, Martha. Nothing in your social services training covered this." I followed him through the peeling front door, bracing for the worst. Hoarding, squalor, the sad remnants of a lonely life. The musty smell hit me first, that distinct scent of old paper and dust. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grimy windows, I froze. The living room walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with photographs. Not random snapshots, but carefully framed portraits, hundreds of them. Each labeled with meticulous handwriting on small brass plates. Sarah Jenkins, leukemia survivor, 1987. Rodriguez family after the mill fire, 1993. Tommy Wilson, first day walking with prosthetic leg, 2001. My hand flew to my mouth as recognition dawned. These were Millfield people. Our people. And beside each frame hung small, sealed envelopes. "There's more," Jim said, leading me deeper into the house. The dining room had been converted into what looked like an office, with filing cabinets lining the walls. Jim pulled open a drawer labeled Medical Assistance, 2010-2015. Inside were folders, each containing bank statements, receipts, and handwritten notes. "Near as we can figure," Jim said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harold Miller was anonymously paying for medical treatments, college tuitions, mortgage payments, you name it, for people all over town, for decades. My legs weakened as I sank into a dusty chair. That's not possible. Harold worked as a janitor at the high school until he retired. He lived like he was destitute. Jim handed me a leather-bound ledger. "Found this in his bedroom. Seems Harold Miller wasn't his real name. His real name was Harold Millfield, as in the Millfield manufacturing fortune." The room seemed to spin. The family that founded the town? But they all died out in the 60s. All except Harold, apparently. Looks like he inherited everything, sold the company, and then just started giving it all away. Secretly. I flipped through the ledger with trembling hands. Meticulous records of donations, investments, and disbursements to Millfield residents spanning over 40 years. Millions of dollars, distributed in times of greatest need, always anonymously. "There's something else," Jim said, leading me to a small back room. It was a simple bedroom, sparse except for a narrow bed, a nightstand, and a wall of bookshelves. But on the nightstand sat a framed photograph of a young couple, the man unmistakably a younger Harold, smiling in front of a 1950s Chevrolet. Beside it lay a small, worn journal. I picked it up, opening to the first page, dated September 12, 1963. "Today I buried my Elizabeth and our unborn child. With them died any reason I had to be Harold Millfield. The fortune that couldn't save them feels like a curse now. What use is money when everything that matters is gone? I've decided Harold Millfield died today too. But perhaps his money can still do some good in this world." I couldn't stop the tears that spilled onto the yellowed page. All these years, the town recluse, the man we'd all ignored, pitied, or feared, had been silently watching over us all, an invisible guardian angel. As I stepped back outside, the morning sun now fully risen over Millfield, I noticed something I'd never seen before. From Harold's porch, you could see the entire town, every street, the town square, the high school in the distance. For 40 years, he'd kept watch from this vantage point, seeing everything, helping from the shadows, asking nothing in return. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "What do we do now, Martha? The press will be all over this once word gets out." I looked down at the journal in my hands, then back at the house that had hidden so many secrets. "First, we deliver these." I nodded toward the sealed envelopes beside each photograph. "Harold's final messages to everyone he helped. Then we need to understand why he chose to live this way." Little did I know that Harold Miller's death was just the beginning of the story, a story that would unravel decades of secrets, challenge everything we thought we knew about our town, and ultimately force me to confront my own painful past. I grew up in Millfield, just like most folks who live here. It's the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone, or at least, that's what we thought until Harold Miller's secret life came to light. My parents raised me in a modest home on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from the high school where Harold mopped floors for 30 years. I remember him from my childhood, a hunched figure with a janitor's cart, moving silently through the hallways after school hours. We called him Creepy Harold back then, a name I'm now deeply ashamed of. Sometimes, when I stayed late for debate club, I'd see him methodically cleaning the trophy cases, his reflection ghostly in the glass beside the golden statues of our town's athletic heroes. Not once did I ever speak to him. Not once did any of us really see him. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in his living room the day after his death, surrounded by evidence that he had seen us all, truly seen us, during our most vulnerable moments. "Martha, you need to see this," called Deputy Reynolds from the kitchen. I found him standing before an open pantry door, staring at a wall covered with newspaper clippings. "It's like he kept a record of every tragedy, every hardship that happened in Millfield," Reynolds said, pointing to the yellowing articles. "Mill fire claims 3 lives. Local family loses home in flood. High school senior paralyzed in car accident." Beside each article were notes in Harold's precise handwriting, amounts, dates, and sometimes just a single word: "Done." As I scanned the wall, a headline from 15 years ago caught my eye. "Young mother dies in childbirth, infant in critical condition." My breath caught. The infant was Lily Jenkins, now a teenager who'd received a mysterious scholarship to attend an expensive medical program for her congenital heart condition last year. "He was tracking needs," I whispered, keeping watch over everyone. The more we uncovered in Harold's house, the more overwhelming the truth became. This man, who'd lived among us as a ghost, had been the town's secret benefactor for decades. Medical bills mysteriously paid, college tuitions anonymously funded, small businesses saved by unexpected investments, homes rebuilt after disasters with money that the insurance found, all Harold Miller. But why had he chosen to live in such austerity? The question haunted me as we worked through his home, cataloging his secret life of philanthropy. In his bedroom closet, we found a single suit, still wrapped in decades-old dry-cleaning plastic. Beside it hung the worn janitor uniforms he'd worn daily. The contrast was heartbreaking. "Martha," Sheriff Dawson called from the basement stairs, "you better come see this." The basement was unlike the rest of the house, immaculately organized with modern filing cabinets and a sleek computer setup that seemed out of place for a man who'd appeared technologically inept. A large map of Millfield dominated one wall, with colored pins marking various locations. "It's everyone he's helped," I realized, recognizing addresses. "He mapped it all." Jim nodded toward the computer. "Tech team says he's got spreadsheets going back to the 90s when he first computerized his records. Before that, it was all handwritten." As we continued our inventory, a pattern emerged in Harold's giving. He hadn't just randomly helped people in crisis. There was a methodology to his generosity, focused particularly on children, medical needs, and education. By mid-afternoon, word had begun to spread through Millfield. Curious onlookers gathered beyond the police tape, their whispers carrying on the spring breeze. I recognized faces in the crowd, many of them unknowing recipients of Harold's silent generosity. Mayor Wilson arrived, his usual confident stride faltering as he took in the scene. "Is it true?" he asked, pulling me aside. "Old Miller was secretly wealthy?" "More than wealthy," I replied. "He was the last living Millfield heir." The mayor's face paled. 10 years ago, his son had received an anonymous donation for an experimental treatment after a devastating accident left him paralyzed. The treatment had allowed him to walk again. "All this time," he whispered. "He was right here, watching us mock him, avoid him." "We need to call a town meeting," I said, "and we need to start delivering these." I held up one of the sealed envelopes that had been attached to the photographs. "Whatever Harold's final messages are, people deserve to hear them." That evening, as I finally left Harold's house, I took one last look at the town spread out below his porch. The setting sun cast long shadows across Millfield, a town that would never be the same again. In my car, I finally allowed myself to open the envelope I'd found beside my own photograph. A picture taken the day I returned to Millfield after college, standing in front of the social services office on my first day. I'd never noticed anyone taking that picture. With trembling fingers, I unfolded Harold's note. "Martha, of all the people in Millfield, you might understand my choices better than most. Your own loss brought you back here to help others. My loss drove me to do the same, just differently. When the truth comes out, they'll need someone to help them understand. That someone is you. In the attic, there's a red box with your name on it. It will explain everything." I sat in my car until night fell completely, Harold's words echoing in my mind. How did he know about my loss? What was in the attic that could possibly explain a lifetime of secrets? And most troubling of all, why did I feel like Harold Miller had chosen me specifically for whatever was coming next? Sleep eluded me that night. Harold's note lay on my nightstand, its cryptic message playing on repeat in my mind. "Your own loss brought you back here to help others." How could he have known about David and the baby? I'd never spoken about it publicly after returning to Millfield. By dawn, I'd given up on rest. I dressed quickly and drove back to Harold's house, determined to find the red box he'd mentioned. The police tape still fluttered around the property, but Sheriff Dawson had given me a key and permission to continue cataloging Harold's effects. The Victorian's attic was accessed through a narrow pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. As I climbed the creaking steps, dust motes danced in the beams of morning light streaming through a small round window. Unlike the meticulously organized spaces below, the attic appeared at first glance to be what you'd expect. Boxes of holiday decorations never used, old furniture draped in sheets, trunks of clothing from another era. But in the far corner, illuminated by that singular ray of sunlight, sat a red metal box with Martha Collins painted in white letters on its lid. My heart pounded as I knelt beside it. The box was locked, but a small key taped to the top waited for me. Inside, I found a leather-bound journal, several folders of documents, and an old photograph of a young woman who looked startlingly like me. The journal's first entry was dated March 15th, 1985, the year I was born. Today, I saw Thomas Collins carrying his newborn daughter out of Millfield General, the same hospital where I lost my Elizabeth. The baby looked so much like what I imagined our daughter might have been. I found myself following them home, watching from a distance as they brought her into the world. Her name is Martha. Perhaps this is madness, but I feel I must watch over this child. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the journal. Harold Miller had been watching me my entire life? The thought sent a chill through me, yet something kept me reading. The entries continued, documenting moments of my childhood I barely remembered myself. My first day of school, the time I broke my arm falling from the oak tree in Madison Park, the speech contest I won in 8th grade. Martha Collins gave her presentation on community responsibility today. Her words about how no one should suffer alone when neighbors can help moved several teachers to tears. She doesn't know it, but she articulated precisely why I've chosen this path. Sometimes I wonder if Elizabeth's spirit somehow lives in this bright, compassionate girl. I had to set the journal down, my emotions too overwhelming to continue. This man, this stranger whom I'd ignored for years, had been a silent guardian throughout my life. Not in a threatening way, but with a distant, protective presence I'd never detected. The folders contained more shocking revelations. One held the deed to my house, the modest bungalow I thought I'd purchased through a first-time homebuyer's assistance program when I returned to Millfield. In reality, Harold had created the program specifically for me, subsidizing most of the cost. Another folder contained newspaper clippings about David's death, the car accident that had taken my fiancé and our unborn child 5 years ago. The tragedy that had driven me back to Millfield, broken and seeking purpose. Beside these was a bank statement showing an anonymous donation to the hospital where I'd recovered, earmarked specifically for my medical bills. The final folder held legal documents naming me as the executor of Harold Miller's estate and the primary beneficiary of his fortune, estimated at over $30 million. I sat back against an old trunk, struggling to breathe. Why me? Why had this man chosen to watch over me, to eventually entrust me with everything he had? The answer came when I forced myself to return to the journal, flipping to entries from the 1960s, before I was born. What I read there changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about Harold, about Millfield itself. Elizabeth Millfield, Harold's wife, had a younger sister named Catherine who'd left Millfield after a bitter family dispute. Catherine had married a man named Robert Collins. They were my grandparents. I was distantly related to Harold Miller. The baby he'd lost with Elizabeth would have been my mother's cousin. In his grief-stricken mind, watching over me had been a way of maintaining a connection to the family he'd lost, to the child he never had. The final entry in the journal, dated just 1 week before his death, read, "My time grows short. The doctor gave me 6 months last year, and I've stretched it as far as I can. Martha has grown into exactly the woman I hoped she would, kind, determined, unafraid to help those in need. She is the perfect person to continue what I started, though she will do it in her own way. I've watched over Millfield from the shadows. Martha will lead it from the light." I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. The responsibility Harold had placed on me felt overwhelming. How could I possibly fill the shoes of a man who had secretly supported an entire town for decades? As I repacked the red box, something small fell from between the journal's pages, a tarnished key on a faded ribbon. A note attached read simply, "The beginning of everything, 1420 Willow Lane." The address meant nothing to me, but I pocketed the key anyway. Whatever Harold had set in motion, I was now irrevocably part of it. As executor of his estate, I would have to decide how to handle the revelation of his identity, his fortune, and his lifetime of secret generosity. But first, I had hundreds of sealed envelopes to deliver, Harold's final messages to the townspeople he'd helped. And judging by the first reactions as news spread through Millfield, those revelations would shake our community to its very foundation. Little did I know that Harold's death and the secrets it unveiled would soon force the entire town, myself included, to confront painful truths we'd all kept hidden for far too long. The first envelope I delivered belonged to Frank Peterson, our high school principal. His photograph in Harold's collection showed him as a much younger man, standing proudly in front of Millfield High with a new Teacher of the Year plaque in his hands. The year was 1989. Frank's hands shook as he opened the envelope in his office, the afternoon sun streaming through the blinds behind him. His eyes widened as he read Harold's message, then filled with tears. "He saved my career," Frank whispered, handing me the letter. My first year teaching, I was ready to quit after a student accused me of inappropriate behavior. It wasn't true, but the rumor was destroying me. Harold wrote that he observed the truth and anonymously provided evidence that cleared my name. I never knew who came forward. Frank looked up at me, his expression haunted. All these years, I passed him in these hallways. I barely acknowledged him. This scene repeated itself across Millfield over the next few days. Everywhere I went with those envelopes, I witnessed the same pattern of shock, recognition, and regret. Harold had touched hundreds of lives, often at their darkest moments, never seeking acknowledgement or thanks. Rebecca Winters learned that her son's mysterious scholarship to MIT had come from Harold, not the Alumni Association as she'd believed. The Jenkins family discovered that their daughter's life-saving heart surgery had been arranged and paid for by the janitor they'd complained about when he accidentally tracked mud into their store during a rainstorm. Old Mr. Grayson, who'd run the hardware store for 50 years, broke down when he read that Harold had secretly purchased the building and reduced the rent to keep the struggling business afloat during the recession. Each revelation rippled through our town, connecting people in ways they'd never realized. Lives saved, educations funded, businesses rescued, homes preserved, all by the man we'd collectively ignored. The town meeting called for Friday evening had to be moved from City Hall to the high school gymnasium to accommodate the crowd. As I entered with Sheriff Dawson and Mayor Wilson, the buzz of hundreds of conversations filled the space. Nearly every adult in Millfield had gathered, many clutching Harold's letters in their hands. Mayor Wilson approached the microphone, his usual political confidence notably absent. "I'm not sure what to say," he began, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet gym. "We're here because a man we thought we knew, or rather, a man we never bothered to know, has left us with an extraordinary legacy and some difficult questions." He paused, looking down at his own letter from Harold. 10 years ago, my son Tommy was told he would never walk again after his accident. An anonymous donor provided the money for experimental treatments that got him back on his feet. That donor was Harold Miller, the same man I've passed on the street hundreds of times without a second glance. The mayor's voice broke. The same man who cleaned the floors of this very gymnasium for 30 years while secretly possessing a fortune that could have bought this entire town. A murmur ran through the crowd. The contrast between Harold's apparent poverty and his actual wealth remained the most perplexing aspect of the mystery. "Mrs. Collins," the mayor said, turning to me, "as the executor of Mr. Miller's estate, perhaps you can help us understand why? Why did he live as he did? Why did he help us in secret?" All eyes turned to me. I stepped forward, clutching Harold's journal. Harold Miller, whose real name was Harold Millfield, lost everything that mattered to him in 1963 when his wife Elizabeth died in childbirth, along with their baby, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. The Millfield fortune couldn't save them, and in his grief, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I opened the journal to a marked page and read Harold's words. "Wealth displayed becomes a wall between people. Wealth concealed can be a bridge. I will live simply, see clearly, and use this money to ease suffering where I find it. No gratitude required, no recognition needed. This is not charity, it is atonement." Looking up at the sea of faces, I continued. Harold believed that his family's fortune had been built partly through exploitation, the old mill's dangerous conditions, the company store that kept workers in debt. He saw his inheritance as a burden to be redistributed, not a privilege to enjoy. The gymnasium remained silent as I explained what we'd discovered about Harold's methodical system of identifying needs in the community and addressing them anonymously. How he'd lived frugally so that more of his wealth could help others. How he'd kept meticulous records of every person he'd helped, tracking their progress through life with the quiet pride of a distant relative. "But there's something else you should know," I said, my voice dropping slightly. Harold wasn't just watching over Millfield out of some abstract sense of duty. For him, this town was family. I revealed what I'd learned about the Millfield family connections to many of the town's oldest families, including my own. How Harold had seen himself as responsible for the descendants of those who had worked for his family's company generations ago. In his mind, you were all his family, I said. And family takes care of family. As the meeting continued, people began to share their own stories of Harold's invisible hand in their lives. Patterns emerged, how he'd particularly focused on children's education and healthcare, how he'd saved multiple family businesses during economic downturns, how he'd quietly funded infrastructure improvements when the town budget fell short. But alongside the gratitude, another emotion surfaced. Shame. Collective shame at how we'd treated the man who had done so much for us. "I made fun of his shabby clothes," admitted Diane from the beauty salon, tears streaming down her face. "Meanwhile, he was paying for my daughter's insulin when our insurance dropped us. I complained about him being slow when he mopped around my office after hours," confessed Dr. Harmon. I never knew he was the anonymous donor who funded our clinic's free care program. As the meeting wound down, Mayor Wilson posed the question on everyone's mind. What do we do now? How do we honor this man properly? The proposals came quickly: rename the high school, build a statue, establish a foundation in his name. All well-intentioned, but somehow missing the point of how Harold had lived his life. I found myself approaching the microphone again. I think Harold would hate all of those ideas, I said bluntly, earning a few surprised laughs. He didn't want recognition. What he wanted was for his work to continue. I took a deep breath before continuing. As executor of his estate, I've been instructed to establish the Millfield Community Trust with the bulk of his fortune. But Harold was clear. This isn't meant to be a traditional charity that people apply to. He wanted the trust to work the way he did, identifying needs quietly and addressing them without fanfare. The gym grew quiet again as I concluded. Maybe the best way to honor Harold isn't with monuments or ceremonies. Maybe it's by changing how we see each other, by noticing the person we've been ignoring, by recognizing need before it becomes desperate, by giving without needing credit. As the meeting dispersed, I felt the weight of Harold's legacy pressing on my shoulders. The red box from the attic sat in my car outside, along with the mysterious key to 1420 Willow Lane, a property I still hadn't been able to identify. Whatever Harold had set in motion wasn't finished. The envelopes were just the beginning. As I watched the townspeople leave the gymnasium, their faces reflecting a complex mix of gratitude and regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that Harold's greatest revelation was yet to come. And somehow, I knew it would force me to confront the grief I'd been carrying since losing David and our unborn child, the grief that had brought me back to Millfield, just as Harold had planned. The address on the key, 1420 Willow Lane, proved difficult to locate. It wasn't on any current map of Millfield, and the county records office had no listing for it. After the town meeting, I spent the weekend searching through historical documents at the library, trying to unravel this final mystery Harold had left for me. It was Mrs. Abernathy, the 92-year-old town historian, who finally provided the answer when I visited her at Millfield Retirement Home on Sunday afternoon. "Willow Lane?" she said, her rheumy eyes lighting up with recognition. That was what they called the private drive to the old Millfield estate, before they renamed it after building the new highway in the 70s. It's Lakeside Drive now, and the numbers all changed. She squinted at the key I showed her. That looks like it might fit the old caretaker's cottage. It was at the edge of the Millfield property, near the lake. 1420 would be about 788 Lakeside Drive today, I reckon. I thanked her and headed straight to the address. 788 Lakeside Drive turned out to be an overgrown lot at the very edge of town, nearly hidden behind a thicket of trees. A narrow gravel path, almost reclaimed by nature, led through the foliage. Following it, I emerged into a small clearing where a stone cottage stood, its windows boarded up, vines crawling across its facade. It looked abandoned, yet something about it felt preserved rather than neglected. The key slid perfectly into the lock on the front door. Inside, the air was surprisingly fresh, not musty as I'd expected. The cottage had been maintained despite its outward appearance of abandonment. The interior was simple: one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a door leading to what I presumed was a bedroom. But what caught my eye immediately were the walls. Like Harold's house, they were covered with photographs, but these were much older. Black and white images of a young Harold and a beautiful woman I recognized as Elizabeth from the photos in the red box. This had been their home, I realized, not the grand Millfield estate that Harold had inherited, but this humble caretaker's cottage by the lake. On the mantelpiece sat a collection of framed photographs documenting their life together. Harold and Elizabeth on their wedding day, picnicking by the lake, working in a garden. They looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. The last photo showed Elizabeth, visibly pregnant, standing in front of the cottage with her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. The joy in her face was palpable. Beside this final image lay a small leather diary with Elizabeth's name embossed on the cover. My hands trembled as I opened it, feeling like an intruder in this preserved moment of happiness before tragedy struck. The diary chronicled Elizabeth's pregnancy, her excitement about becoming a mother, and, surprisingly, her concerns about the Millfield fortune. Harold and I agree, she had written, that no child should grow up burdened by too much privilege and too little purpose. We will raise our child here in the cottage, not in the mansion. We will teach them the value of work, the responsibility of wealth, and the joy of helping others. The final entry was dated just one day before she died. Tomorrow we go to the hospital to welcome our daughter. We've chosen to name her Hope because that's what she represents to us. Hope for a better future for the Millfield legacy than its complicated past. I closed the diary, tears streaming down my face. Harold had lost not just his wife and child that day, but an entire future they had carefully planned together. A future dedicated to reforming the Millfield legacy. In his grief, he had chosen to honor that vision in the only way he could imagine, by living simply and using the fortune to help others secretly, just as they had planned to teach their daughter to do. The bedroom contained a small desk where I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, another message from Harold. Inside was a letter and a deed to the cottage and surrounding 5 acres. Martha, the letter began, if you're reading this, you've found the beginning of everything. The place where Elizabeth and I planned our future, the home where we intended to raise our daughter away from the corrupting influence of wealth and status. After Elizabeth died, I couldn't bear to live here, but I couldn't let it go either, so I preserved it, just as it was when we were happy. I'm giving this place to you because, in many ways, you've lived the life we imagined for our hope. You've chosen service over comfort, compassion over convenience. The cottage needs someone to bring life back to it. Perhaps you, or perhaps someone else you'll find who needs a fresh start. There's one more thing I need to tell you, something I've never told anyone else. The night Elizabeth died, I was not at the hospital. We had argued that morning about the company. I wanted to sell it. She wanted to reform it from within. I stormed out, drove around for hours, and returned too late. By the time I reached the hospital, I had lost everything. My absence in her final hours has haunted me every day since. This is the true purpose of all I've done, not generosity, but atonement. I failed the person I loved most when she needed me most. I've spent my life trying to ensure I never failed anyone in need again. You, Martha, have your own grief to reconcile. Don't let it consume you as mine nearly did me. The difference between us is that you came back to help others openly, with your whole heart, while I hid behind anonymity. Your way is braver. Your way brings not just assistance, but connection. The cottage is yours now, along with my final request. Find a way to continue what Elizabeth and I started, but do it your way. Do it in the light. I sat on the dusty floor of the cottage for a long time, Harold's letter in my lap, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. His confession about being absent when Elizabeth died explained so much about his life choices, the extreme self-denial, the obsessive record-keeping, the anonymous giving. He'd been trying to atone for what he saw as his greatest failure. As twilight fell, casting long shadows through the cottage windows, I made a decision. Harold had entrusted me with his legacy, but I couldn't, carry it exactly as he had. His way had been born of grief and guilt. Mine would have to be different. I locked the cottage and drove back to town, my mind racing with possibilities. The Millfield Community Trust needed direction, and the town needed healing. Not just from Harold's death, but from the uncomfortable truths his secret life had forced us all to confront. By the time I reached my house, I knew what I had to do next. Harold had spent decades watching over Millfield from the shadows. Now it was time to bring his mission into the light, and in doing so, perhaps help us all find redemption for the ways we'd failed each other little. Did I know that the cottage would soon become the center of a conflict that would divide our town and force me to choose between honoring Harold's legacy and protecting those he'd tried so hard to help? The news about Harold Miller's true identity spread through Millfield like wildfire. By Monday morning, reporters from regional newspapers and even a crew from a Portland television station had descended on our town, hungry for the story of the secret millionaire janitor. I avoided them as best I could, focusing instead on the mountain of work before me. As executor of Harold's estate, I had legal responsibilities to fulfill, and as the only person who truly understood the scope of his giving, I felt a moral obligation to ensure his work continued properly. The Millfield Community Trust required structure, oversight, and clear guidelines, all while maintaining the spirit of Harold's personalized, discreet approach to helping others. I spent days consulting with attorneys, financial advisors, and community leaders, trying to create a framework that would honor Harold's intentions while functioning effectively in the open. Meanwhile, the cottage at 788 Lakeside Drive became my sanctuary. Each evening after work, I would drive out there, slowly clearing away decades of neglect from the garden, repairing broken windows, and making the space livable again. Something about restoring Elizabeth and Harold's dream home helped me process my own grief in ways years of therapy never had. One evening, as I was pulling weeds from what had once been Elizabeth's flower garden, Sheriff Dawson's cruiser pulled up the gravel drive. He looked troubled as he approached. "Evening, Martha. Place is looking better already," he said, surveying my work. "It's therapeutic," I replied, wiping dirt from my hands. "What brings you out here, Jim?" He sighed heavily. "Two things, neither pleasant. First, Harold's house was broken into last night. Nothing taken that we can tell, but someone went through his records pretty thoroughly." My stomach tightened. Who would do that? And what were they looking for? That's what concerns me. Most of the town now knows Harold was helping people secretly. Some of those situations were sensitive. He lowered his voice. Not everyone wants their personal hardships made public. I nodded, understanding immediately. Harold had helped people through divorces, bankruptcies, addictions, legal troubles, private struggles they might not want exposed, even if the help had been welcome. "What's the second thing?" I asked, dreading the answer. Mayor Wilson called an emergency council meeting for tomorrow night. Topic is the proper disposition of the Millfield estate. I think some folks have ideas about that money that don't align with what you've been planning. I wasn't surprised. $30 million was a transformative amount for a town the size of Millfield. The temptation to direct it toward pet projects, infrastructure, or economic development would be strong for any local government. "Thanks for the heads up," I said. "I'll be there." After Jim left, I sat on the cottage's front step, watching the sunset reflect on the distant lake. Harold's words echoed in my mind. "Find a way to continue what Elizabeth and I started, but do it your way. Do it in the light." The light was proving more complicated than the shadows. The council meeting the next evening was standing room only. I arrived early to find a seat near the front, nodding to familiar faces as the room filled. Many people I'd delivered envelopes to over the past week gave me encouraging smiles, but others avoided my gaze. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order, his tone overly formal. "As you all know, recent events have presented our community with an unprecedented situation. The revelation that Harold Miller was actually Harold Millfield, and the subsequent disclosure of his considerable fortune, raises questions about the future of those assets and their potential benefit to Millfield." He nodded to a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. "We've invited Mr. Philip Hargrove, an economic development consultant, to present some possibilities for how these funds might revitalize our community." For the next 20 minutes, Hargrove outlined an ambitious plan involving a riverfront development project, a technology incubator in the abandoned mill building, and a tourism campaign rebranding Millfield as a historic manufacturing town turned arts community. "With the Millfield fortune as seed money," he concluded, "we could transform this town's economy within 5 years, creating jobs, increasing property values, and establishing Millfield as a destination rather than a pass-through." Applause broke out from several council members and many in the audience. Mayor Wilson smiled broadly. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. Now, before we open for public comment, I believe Councilman Reeves has a proposal." George Reeves, the longest-serving member of the council, stood and cleared his throat. "In light of these exciting possibilities, I move that the council formally request that the executor of the Millfield estate prioritize community development projects when distributing these funds." "Second," called another council member immediately. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. They were attempting to pressure me into diverting Harold's fortune away from his intended purpose and toward their vision of progress. Mayor Wilson looked directly at me. "Mrs. Collins, as executor, would you like to respond before we vote on this resolution?" I stood, feeling every eye in the room on me. Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to clarify something important. The Millfield fortune is not, legally speaking, available for the council's direction. Harold Miller's will is very specific about how his assets are to be used. I opened the folder I'd brought and removed a copy of the will. The bulk of his estate is designated for the establishment of the Millfield Community Trust, with the explicit purpose of continuing the work of identifying and addressing individual needs within the community, with an emphasis on healthcare, education, housing security, and crisis intervention. Murmurs spread through the room as I continued. While community development is valuable, it wasn't Harold's focus. He believed in helping people directly, one family at a time, when they needed it most. Councilwoman Peters spoke up. But surely some of these funds could be directed toward projects that would help everyone? A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. Harold didn't believe in waiting for rising tides, I replied. He believed in reaching out a hand to those drowning today. Mayor Wilson's expression hardened. Mrs. Collins, with all due respect, Harold Miller, or Millfield, is gone. This fortune rightfully belongs to the community he secretly observed for decades. Shouldn't the democratically elected representatives of that community have some say in how it's used? The tension in the room was palpable as I responded. Harold's fortune was his to direct, Mayor Wilson, and he directed it toward continuing the work he'd been doing all along, work that helped your son walk again, if I recall correctly. A hush fell over the room at this pointed reminder. The mayor's face flushed. Furthermore, I continued more gently, the trust is already established. The papers were filed last week. As trustee, I'm legally bound to administer the funds according to Harold's wishes. This isn't about what I want or what the council wants. It's about respecting the explicit intentions of a man who dedicated his life to this town. Before the mayor could respond, the door at the back of the room burst open. Rebecca Winters, whose son had received the MIT scholarship from Harold, strode down the center aisle. I wasn't going to speak tonight, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. But I can't sit by and watch this. When my Zachary got that scholarship, it wasn't just money. It was someone saying, I see your potential when no one else does. That changed his life more than any riverfront development ever could. She turned to face the crowd. Harold Miller saw needs that were invisible to everyone else. He helped people who had nowhere else to turn. That's what his money should continue to do. Others began to stand and share their stories. The small business owner who'd survived the recession because of Harold's anonymous loan, the family whose medical debt had mysteriously vanished, the young couple who'd received down payment assistance for their first home. As the testimonials continued, I watched the council members' expressions shift from frustration to resignation. They couldn't fight the emotional power of these personal stories, especially when many in the room had received similar help themselves. Finally, Mayor Wilson raised his hands. I think we've heard enough to recognize that this is a more nuanced situation than we initially considered. Perhaps we should table the resolution and instead invite Mrs. Collins to present her plans for the trust at our next meeting. I nodded my agreement, relief washing over me. The immediate threat had passed, but I knew this wouldn't be the last challenge to Harold's legacy. Too much money and too many competing interests were involved. As the meeting adjourned, people clustered in small groups, discussing the evening's events. I gathered my papers, exhausted by the confrontation, but determined to stand firm. Sheriff Dawson approached, keeping his voice low. Heads up, Martha. There's a man in the back who's been watching you all evening. Says he's a lawyer from Portland representing interested parties in the Millfield estate. I followed his gaze to a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit who stood observing me with calculated interest. What interested parties? I asked. Harold had no living relatives, Jim shrugged. He wouldn't say, just that he'd be in touch soon. As I left the building, the mysterious lawyer made no move to approach me, but I could feel his eyes following as I walked to my car. A new complication, it seemed, in an already complicated situation. Driving back to the cottage that night, I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than ever. Harold had entrusted me with not just his fortune, but with the continuation of his life's purpose. Now I would have to defend that purpose against those who saw only the money, not the meaning behind it. And somewhere out there, unknown interested parties were circling, adding yet another layer of uncertainty to a situation already fraught with conflict. As I turned onto the gravel drive leading to the cottage, my headlights illuminated something unexpected. A figure standing on the front porch. My heart raced until I recognized Dr. Eleanor Hayes, Millfield's oldest practicing physician and one of the few people who'd been in town even longer than Harold. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said as I approached. "But after tonight's meeting, I thought it was time I shared something with you, something about Harold and Elizabeth that might help you understand the full story." "What do you mean?" I asked, unlocking the cottage door and inviting her inside. Dr. Hayes looked around the small living room, her eyes lingering on the photographs of the young couple. "I was there, you see. I was the doctor on call the night Elizabeth died." She turned to me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that had not diminished with time. "And there's something about that night that Harold never knew, something that might explain why he chose you, of all people, to carry on his work." Dr. Hayes settled into the armchair by the fireplace as I made tea in the cottage's small kitchen. Though well into her 80s, she carried herself with the straight-backed dignity of someone accustomed to being respected and obeyed. Her hands, spotted with age but still steady, wrapped around the mug I offered her. "I've kept this secret for nearly 60 years, she began, her voice low as if the walls might be listening. At first, because Harold was in no condition to hear it. Later, because it seemed the kindest thing to let him believe what he believed." She took a sip of tea, gathering her thoughts. "The night Elizabeth went into labor, there were complications from the beginning. Preeclampsia, dangerous high blood pressure. We didn't have the resources we have now. I sent for Harold immediately, but as you know, he'd left after their argument." I nodded, remembering his confession in the letter. What Harold never knew was that we almost saved them both. Dr. Hayes's eyes grew distant with the memory. "Elizabeth held on through hours of difficult labor. The baby, a girl, was delivered alive. Tiny, struggling, but alive." My breath caught. "Harold's daughter didn't die at birth?" "She lived for almost 2 hours," Dr. Hayes confirmed. "Elizabeth regained consciousness briefly, held her daughter, named her Hope, as they'd planned. She made me promise to tell Harold that their baby had lived, had been held, had been loved. But when Harold finally arrived, Elizabeth had already passed. He was destroyed, inconsolable. When I tried to tell him about the baby's brief life, he couldn't hear me. He kept repeating that he'd lost them both, that it was his fault, that he should have been there." Dr. Hayes set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly now. "In the days that followed, I tried again to tell him, but he'd retreated completely into his grief. Then he disappeared, sold the mansion, changed his name, became the Harold Miller we all thought we knew. By the time he resurfaced in Millfield as the school janitor, years had passed. I made the decision, right or wrong, to keep Elizabeth's final moments and the baby's brief life to myself. He had created a new identity built around his guilt and grief. I feared that learning the truth so long after might break him all over again." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. Harold had lived his entire life believing he'd never had the chance to meet his daughter, never knowing that Elizabeth had regained consciousness, never hearing that they'd had those precious moments together without him. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "Because of the date, Martha. Elizabeth died on April 17th, 1963. Your birthday is April 17th, 1985, exactly 22 years later. When you returned to Millfield after your own tragedy, having lost your fiancé and unborn child, Harold saw it as more than coincidence. In his mind, you were connected to his hope somehow, born on the same date, suffering a similar loss." The realization washed over me like ice water. That's why he watched over me my whole life, why he chose me as his executor. He saw me as, what, a reincarnation? A second chance? "I don't think Harold believed in anything as mystical as reincarnation," Dr. Hayes said gently. "But he did believe in patterns, in meaning. When you came back to Millfield and began working in social services, helping others through their darkest moments, I think he saw you as living the life his daughter might have lived, the life he and Elizabeth had planned for her in this very cottage." She gestured to the photographs on the walls. They wanted to raise a daughter who would understand both privilege and responsibility, who would use the Millfield resources to help others directly, personally. When he saw you doing exactly that, with no connection to wealth or privilege, he must have felt it was somehow meant to be. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness, trying to make sense of it all. My entire relationship with Harold, or rather his relationship with me, had been built on a connection I'd never known existed. I'd been a surrogate for the daughter he'd lost, a replacement for the future that had been stolen from him. "There's one more thing," Dr. Hayes said, reaching into her purse. She withdrew a small worn photograph and handed it to me. "This is the only picture of hope that exists. The nurse took it when Elizabeth was holding her. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. I think that moment is now." The photograph showed Elizabeth, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny swaddled infant. The love in her expression was unmistakable, transcending the grainy black and white image and the decades that had passed. "She should be here," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "In this cottage, with her family." Dr. Hayes nodded sadly. "Yes, she should. But she isn't. Instead, you're here, not as a replacement for hope, but as someone who can understand what Harold was trying to do and why it mattered so much to him." As Dr. Hayes prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Harold wasn't perfect, Martha. His methods were sometimes questionable. The watching, the secret interventions, the record keeping. It came from a place of deep pain and a desperate need to atone. But the core of what he did, seeing people's needs and meeting them directly, personally, that was pure. That's what Elizabeth would have wanted. That's what their daughter might have continued." After she left, I sat for a long time with the photograph of Elizabeth and baby Hope, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about Harold Miller. His obsession with me wasn't as simple as distant family connection. It was a complex web of grief, guilt, symbolic thinking, and perhaps a touch of madness born from unimaginable loss. Yet underlying it all was a vision that had started in this cottage. A vision of wealth used responsibly, personally, to help others in need. A vision that, through the strangest of circumstances, had now been passed to me. As I finally prepared for bed in the small room that had once been intended for baby Hope, I placed the photograph on the nightstand. Whatever Harold's reasons for choosing me, whatever complicated emotional and psychological factors had driven his lifetime of secret philanthropy, the responsibility was now mine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the mysterious lawyer, the town council's ambitions, the ongoing process of delivering Harold's final messages. But tonight, in this cottage where everything had begun, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. Harold had spent his life trying to atone for his absence at Elizabeth and Hope's deaths. Perhaps my role wasn't just to continue his work, but to help him find the forgiveness he'd never been able to give himself. The mysterious lawyer made his move the very next morning. I had just arrived at my office in the social services building when my assistant announced that a Mr. Lawrence Blackwood was waiting to see me. He was tall and imposing, with the polished demeanor of someone who charged by the hour and expected to be worth it. The business card he handed me bore the name of one of Portland's most prestigious law firms. "Ms. Collins," he began once we were seated in my office, "I represent certain parties who have a vested interest in the estate of Harold Millfield." "What parties?" I asked directly. Harold had no living relatives. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Not relatives in the traditional sense, no. My clients represent the corporate interests that were once part of Millfield Manufacturing. When Harold Millfield sold the company in 1964, certain contingency clauses were included in the contracts, clauses that may be relevant now that the full extent of his assets has become public." My stomach tightened. "What kind of clauses?" "Provisions regarding the potential reversion of proceeds should certain conditions occur," he replied smoothly. "The details are complex, but in essence, if Harold Millfield died without direct heirs and without having established a clear charitable foundation during his lifetime, a significant portion of the sale proceeds, with accumulated interest, could revert to the corporate entities." "That's absurd," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Harold's will is clear. The Millfield Community Trust is established and operational." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. A trust established 1 week before his death, after decades of hoarding wealth? My clients believe a court might find that suspicious, perhaps even evidence of diminished capacity or undue influence. The implication that I had somehow manipulated Harold hung in the air between us. Furthermore, he continued, there's the matter of how these assets were managed over the decades. Our preliminary investigation suggests that Harold Miller, or Millfield, engaged in numerous financial transactions that might not withstand legal scrutiny. Undocumented gifts, payments made under false pretenses, interventions in private business matters without proper disclosure. He was helping people, I said through gritted teeth. Perhaps, or perhaps he was exercising inappropriate control over individuals and businesses through financial manipulation. The courts will have to decide. He placed a thick envelope on my desk. This is a formal notice of our intent to contest the will and challenge the establishment of the Millfield Community Trust. My clients would prefer to settle this matter privately, of course. They're prepared to offer the town of Millfield a one-time grant of $5 million in exchange for the remainder of the estate. $5 million instead of 30, a fraction of Harold's fortune, offered as a token while they attempted to claim the rest. And if I refuse? Blackwood shrugged. Then we proceed to litigation, during which time I imagine the trust's assets would be frozen. Every person Harold secretly helped over the years might find their financial arrangements scrutinized in court. Every business that received his anonymous support might face questions about unreported income or benefits. Every town official who looked the other way when building permits, mysteriously appeared, or tax issues suddenly resolved would face examination. The threat was clear. Fight us, and we'll expose everything and everyone. I'll need to consult with the trust's attorneys, I said, struggling to maintain my composure. Of course. Blackwood stood, straightening his already immaculate suit. We'll expect your response within 10 business days. After that, we'll have no choice but to proceed with formal legal action. After he left, I sat frozen at my desk, the formal notice untouched before me. The magnitude of the threat was overwhelming. If Blackwood's clients succeeded, not only would Harold's fortune be diverted from its intended purpose, but the process could expose the private struggles of countless Millfield residents who'd received Harold's help over the decades. I called the trust's law firm immediately and forwarded Blackwood's documents. Their initial assessment was not encouraging. While Harold's will seemed solid, the decades of secretive financial dealings created vulnerabilities. A protracted legal battle could indeed freeze the trust's assets for years, and potentially expose sensitive information about recipients of Harold's generosity. By mid-afternoon, word of Blackwood's visit had somehow spread through town. Mayor Wilson called an emergency meeting with the council and key community members, including me, for that evening. The council chambers were tense as I explained the situation. This firm is essentially threatening to air all of Millfield's dirty laundry if we don't hand over most of Harold's money, I concluded. Mayor Wilson, who had been so eager to direct the trust's funds toward development projects just yesterday, now looked genuinely concerned. If they start digging into every instance where Harold intervened, there are things some people in this town would prefer stayed buried. Councilman Reeves nodded grimly. Not just individuals, the town itself benefited from Harold's creative problem-solving more than once. Remember the bridge collapse in '97? The state funding that appeared so quickly? I never questioned it at the time, but now I wonder. So we just give in to blackmail? Rebecca Winters demanded, her voice rising. Let these corporate vultures take what Harold meant for the people of this town? The debate continued for over an hour, growing increasingly heated. Some argued for fighting the claim regardless of cost or consequences. Others advocated accepting the settlement offer to avoid prolonged conflict. The divide seemed insurmountable. Finally, Sheriff Dawson, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Before we tear ourselves apart over this, maybe we should consider what Harold would want. Martha, you probably understand his intentions better than anyone now. What do you think? All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath, thinking of the cottage, of Elizabeth's diary, of the photograph of baby Hope. Harold spent his life trying to atone for what he saw as his greatest failure, not being there when his family needed him most, I said slowly. Everything he did afterward was about being there for others in their moments of need. I think I think he would be devastated to see his legacy become something that hurts the very people he tried to help. I looked around the room at the worried faces of my neighbors. But I also think he would fight for what he believed was right. He wouldn't want his fortune to go back to the corporate interests he walked away from 60 years ago. So what do we do? Mayor Wilson asked. An idea had been forming in my mind since Blackwood's visit. A risky one, but perhaps the only way forward that honored Harold's true intentions. What if we changed the terms of the fight? I suggested. Blackwood's threat has power because we're afraid of exposure. But what if we took control of the narrative ourselves? I outlined my proposal. A voluntary disclosure program where anyone who had received Harold's help could come forward on their own terms, sharing as much or as little of their story as they felt comfortable with. We would create a community archive of Harold's impact, not the detailed, sometimes invasive records he'd kept, but the human stories of how his intervention had changed lives. If we bring these stories into the light ourselves, I explained, Blackwood loses his leverage. He can't threaten to expose what we've already acknowledged. And more importantly, we transform what he sees as questionable financial manipulations into what they truly were, acts of community care. The room fell silent as people considered the implications. Such a disclosure would require tremendous trust and vulnerability from those who had received Harold's help, many of whom had never spoken publicly about their struggles. It would have to be completely voluntary, I emphasized, and people would share only what they're comfortable with. But if enough of us come forward, we create a powerful counter-narrative to the corporate interests' claims. Rebecca Winters was the first to stand. I'll start. Everyone knows Harold sent my son to MIT, but they don't know why it mattered so much. After my husband left, Zach was ready to give up on college completely to help support us. Harold didn't just pay for his education, he saved him from giving up on his future. One by one, others began to voice their support. By the end of the evening, we had formed a committee to implement the voluntary disclosure program and coordinate with the Trust's legal team on our response to Blackwood's threat. As the meeting adjourned, Sheriff Dawson pulled me aside. Bold move, Martha. But are you sure people will come forward? Some of what Harold helped with was deeply personal. I'm not sure, I admitted. But I think we've all been carrying these secrets long enough. Harold's secrets, our own secrets. Maybe it's time to bring them into the light, on our own terms. Jim nodded thoughtfully. You know, when my wife was sick 10 years ago, and the department's insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment she needed, money appeared in our account overnight. I never told anyone. Never knew it was Harold until last week. Will you share that story publicly? I asked. I will now, he said firmly. If it helps protect what Harold built, I will. As I drove back to the cottage that night, I felt both terrified and exhilarated by the path we'd chosen. We were taking an enormous risk, asking people to expose vulnerabilities they'd kept hidden for years. But there was also something profoundly right about it, about bringing Harold's work into the light, not as something shameful or manipulative, but as evidence of a community caring for its own. In the cottage, I looked again at the photograph of Elizabeth and baby Hope. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I whispered to them. I hope this is what you would have wanted. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees around the cottage. For a moment, it almost sounded like a response. The next week passed in a blur of activity. We set up a secure website and a private room at the library where people could record their stories about Harold's help. The response was slow at first, a trickle of cautious participants testing the waters of disclosure. But as the first stories were carefully documented and shared with the Trust's legal team, something remarkable began to happen. People started talking to each other, not just about Harold, but about the struggles they'd faced and the unexpected help that had arrived at their darkest moments. Frank Peterson, the high school principal, was one of the first to publicly acknowledge Harold's intervention in clearing his name from false accusations early in his teaching career. His disclosure prompted 3 other teachers to come forward with similar stories of professional crises resolved through Harold's behind-the-scenes support. The Jenkins family shared how Harold had not only paid for their daughter's heart surgery, but had also arranged for specialized care at a Boston hospital and covered their living expenses during the months of recovery. Old Mr. Grayson revealed that Harold had purchased his hardware store building during the recession and reduced the rent to a nominal amount, saving both the business and the 5 jobs it provided in the community. By the end of the week, we had documented over 100 stories spanning decades, a tapestry of community care that painted a very different picture than the financial manipulations Blackwood had threatened to expose. But the most powerful story came from an unexpected source. Mayor Wilson requested a private meeting with me at the cottage on Friday evening. He arrived looking uncharacteristically nervous, his usual political confidence nowhere to be seen. "I haven't been entirely honest about Harold's help to my family," he began as we sat on the cottage's front porch. "Yes, he paid for Tommy's experimental treatments after the accident, but there was more to it." The mayor stared out at the darkening lake as he continued. "The accident that paralyzed Tommy wasn't really an accident. He was 17, drinking with friends, showing off on that old dock by the river. I was running for mayor for the first time. A scandal involving underage drinking would have ended my campaign." He took a shaky breath. Harold somehow knew. He arranged for the medical reports to omit the blood alcohol results. He paid off the other kids' families to keep quiet. He created the narrative of a tragic accident rather than teenage recklessness. "And then he paid for the treatments," I said softly. Mayor Wilson nodded, tears in his eyes. "He saved my son twice, once from his own poor choices, and then from their physical consequences. And he saved my career before it even started." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because this is the kind of story Blackwood could use to destroy people," he replied. "But it's also the kind of story that shows what Harold was really doing, seeing the whole person, not just their worst moment. Tommy made a terrible mistake, but Harold saw that his whole future shouldn't be defined by it." The mayor turned to face me directly. "I'm going to include this in my statement for the legal case, all of it. If enough of us are willing to be this honest, Blackwood's threats lose their power." His courage moved me deeply. "Thank you, Richard. This can't have been easy to decide." "Actually, it was Tommy who convinced me," he admitted. "When I told him about Blackwood's threats, he said, 'Dad, I've been living with this secret for 10 years. Maybe it's time to live in the truth.'" As Mayor Wilson left, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had begun as a defensive legal strategy was becoming something more profound. A community reckoning with its past, acknowledging both vulnerabilities and strengths, and recognizing how deeply interconnected all our lives had been through Harold's invisible support. The following Monday, our legal team sent a formal response to Blackwood, rejecting the settlement offer and countering with a comprehensive defense of the trust. They included a selection of the voluntary disclosures, with permission, and indicated our readiness to make these stories public if litigation proceeded. Blackwood's response came 2 days later, a request for a meeting rather than an immediate legal filing. Our attorneys advised caution, but agreed that direct negotiation might be productive. The meeting was set for Thursday morning at the Trust's Portland law offices. I insisted on attending, along with Mayor Wilson and the Trust's lead attorney, Victoria Chen. Blackwood arrived with 2 corporate executives, representatives of the companies that had absorbed pieces of the original Millfield manufacturing over the decades. Their expressions were carefully neutral as we all took seats around the conference table. "We've reviewed your response and the accompanying testimonials," Blackwood began. "They make for compelling reading. However, they don't change the fundamental legal issues at stake." Victoria Chen smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Mr. Blackwood, they establish a clear pattern of charitable intent spanning decades, which directly contradicts your claim that the trust was a last-minute creation. They also demonstrate that Mr. Millfield's financial interventions were not, as you suggested, inappropriate manipulations, but rather carefully considered charitable acts." "Acts without proper documentation or oversight," one of the executives countered. "Actually," I interjected, "Harold kept meticulous records of every intervention, records that document exactly how the proceeds from the company sale were used to benefit the community over 60 years. Records that would make fascinating reading for the media should this case proceed to court." I slid a folder across the table, a summary of Harold's record-keeping system, with selected examples of his detailed tracking of corporate behavior in Millfield over the decades. Harold didn't just watch over individuals, I explained as Blackwood paged through the documents with a deepening frown. He also monitored the corporate descendants of his family's company, the environmental testing he privately funded near the old mill site in the 80s, the worker safety violations he documented at the plastics plant in the 90s, the evidence he gathered about questionable labor practices as recently as 2010. Mayor Wilson leaned forward. Harold Millfield felt responsible for the company his family had built, even decades after he sold it. He used his fortune partly to mitigate what he saw as ongoing corporate harms to our community. The executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria Chen seized the moment. "We're prepared to proceed to litigation if necessary," she said calmly, "during which all of these records would become public. Alternatively, we could discuss a more mutually beneficial resolution." After a tense silence, Blackwood asked, "What kind of resolution?" By the time we left the meeting 3 hours later, we had the framework of an agreement. The corporate claimants would withdraw their challenge to the trust in exchange for a limited release of liability for past environmental and labor issues in Millfield. The trust would establish a dedicated fund for community health monitoring related to historical industrial activities, and the companies would match those funds as a corporate citizenship initiative. It wasn't a complete victory. The health monitoring program would require a significant allocation from the trust, but it preserved the vast majority of Harold's fortune for its intended purpose while addressing one of his long-standing concerns about corporate accountability. As we drove back to Millfield, Mayor Wilson shook his head in amazement. Even from beyond the grave, Harold managed to hold those companies accountable. Remarkable. I smiled, thinking of the detailed records Harold had kept all those years, not just of people's needs, but of corporate behavior affecting his beloved town. He was playing a very long game. I don't think we've yet discovered all the ways he was working to protect Millfield. That evening, I returned to the cottage with a profound sense of relief. The immediate threat to Harold's legacy had been averted. The voluntary disclosure program had transformed potential scandal into a powerful testament to community resilience. The trust was secure and could begin its work in earnest. As I sat on the porch watching the sunset reflect on the lake, I felt, for the first time since Harold's death, that I was truly fulfilling the responsibility he had entrusted to me. Not by doing exactly what he had done, working in secret, alone, driven by guilt and grief, but by bringing his vision into the light, making it a shared community endeavor. I took out the photograph of Elizabeth and baby Hope, now framed on the cottage's mantelpiece. "We're doing it differently," I told them softly. "But I think we're honoring what you wanted, what you both wanted, for the Millfield legacy." The breeze off the lake seemed to whisper in response, carrying the scent of new growth from Elizabeth's garden, which I had begun to restore. Spring was fully established now, new life emerging from ground that had lain dormant for decades. Like the garden, Millfield itself was awakening to a new understanding of its past and its interconnections. How one man's quiet interventions had woven a safety net beneath the community, catching people when they fell, supporting them until they could stand again. Now that safety net was becoming visible, being strengthened by shared knowledge and collective purpose. Harold had worked alone, carrying the weight of his grief and guilt. The trust would work differently, openly, collaboratively, but with the same fundamental commitment to seeing people's needs and meeting them directly. As darkness fell over the lake, I made a decision. The cottage that Harold had preserved as a memorial to what might have been would become something new, a living center for the trust's work, a place where people could come for help, for connection, for the kind of personalized support Harold had provided from the shadows. Elizabeth and Harold had dreamed of raising their daughter here, teaching her to use the family's resources wisely and compassionately. That dream had died 60 years ago in a hospital room. But something new could grow in its place. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a different kind of legacy, one that honored the past while creating a new future. I would live here, I decided. Make this cottage my home and the heart of the trust's operations. Not as the daughter Harold never raised, but as the caretaker of a vision that had begun here and would now continue in a new form. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more difficult decisions about how to allocate resources, more balancing of individual needs against community priorities. But for the first time since I'd returned to Millfield after my own loss, I felt a sense of purpose that was larger than my grief, a connection to something that would outlast me. Harold Millfield, had spent his life trying to atone for his absence at the moment his family needed him most. In doing so, he had created something profound, a model of community care that saw people as whole human beings, not just problems to be solved or statistics to be managed. Now it was my turn to build on that foundation, to bring his work from darkness into light, from solitary burden to shared responsibility. As the stars appeared over the lake, I whispered a promise to Harold, to Elizabeth, to baby Hope, and to myself. We'll continue what you started, but we'll do it together, in the light. 5 years passed quickly. The Millfield Community Trust evolved from a controversial inheritance into a vibrant center of community life. The cottage, restored to its original charm but updated for its new purpose, became known simply as Hope House, a place where anyone in need could find personalized support without bureaucracy or judgment. I made it my home and the Trust's headquarters, living in the small bedroom that had once been intended for Harold and Elizabeth's daughter, while converting the main living spaces into welcoming areas for Trust activities. The voluntary disclosure program that had begun as a legal defense strategy transformed into an ongoing community history project. People continued to share their stories of Harold's help, creating a rich tapestry of interconnection that spanned generations. These stories guided our work, helping us understand the kinds of intervention that made the most meaningful difference in people's lives. Like Harold, we focused on education, healthcare, housing security, and crisis response. But unlike Harold, we worked openly, collaboratively, and with the full participation of those we helped. The Trust's resources, carefully invested, grew rather than diminished, allowing us to expand our work beyond Millfield to neighboring communities that had never had a secret benefactor watching over them. On this particular April morning, the 5th anniversary of Harold's death and coincidentally my birthday, I stood on the cottage porch watching volunteers set up for the annual community gathering we held in Harold's memory. Tables were being arranged on the lawn sloping down to the lake. Children darted between adults carrying food and decorations. The event had grown each year, becoming a celebration not just of Harold's legacy, but of the community's commitment to continuing his work in the open. "Quite a change from when you first came here," observed Dr. Hayes, now 93 but still sharp as ever, as she joined me on the porch. "It's everything I hoped for," I admitted, "and nothing I expected when I found out about Harold's secret life." We watched as Mayor Wilson, now in his 3rd term, having been re-elected largely on the strength of his honest disclosure about his son's accident, directed the placement of a new bench near the lakefront. The bench was dedicated to Elizabeth and Hope Millfield, a permanent acknowledgement of the family whose tragedy had ultimately led to so much good. "Have you decided what you're going to announce today?" Dr. Hayes asked. "People are speculating." I smiled. The Trust had a tradition of announcing a major new initiative at each annual gathering. Last year, it had been a scholarship program for Millfield High graduates. The year before, a medical debt forgiveness fund. "You'll have to wait and see like everyone else," I teased. In truth, this year's announcement was particularly meaningful to me. After 5 years of focusing exclusively on the Trust, I had made a personal decision that would both honor Harold's legacy and create my own path forward. The gathering began at noon, with over 200 people spread across the cottage grounds. Children played along the lakeshore, while adults shared food and stories. Many wore blue ribbons, the symbol we'd adopted for those who had received Harold's help and chosen to acknowledge it publicly. At 3 o'clock, I called everyone together near Elizabeth's garden, now restored to full bloom with heritage plants, matching those in the old photographs. 5 years ago, I began, we gathered in shock and confusion after discovering that the town recluse we had all ignored was actually our secret benefactor. Today, we gather in celebration of how that discovery has transformed our community. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harold Millfield, worked alone, driven by grief and guilt, watching over this town from the shadows. His methods were sometimes questionable, but his heart was true. He saw needs that others missed and met them directly, personally, without seeking recognition or thanks. I gestured to the cottage behind me. This was meant to be a family home, a place where Harold and Elizabeth would raise their daughter Hope to understand both privilege and responsibility. Fate had other plans, but in a way, that vision has still come to pass. This cottage has become the heart of a different kind of family, our community family, where we learn together how wealth can be used responsibly to help our neighbors in need. The crowd nodded, many wiping away tears. Harold's story had become our shared story, his mission, our collective purpose. Today, I want to announce the Trust's next major initiative, I continued. But first, I need to share something personal. I took a deep breath, my hand instinctively touching the small bump just beginning to show beneath my dress. As many of you know, I came back to Millfield 5 years ago, after losing my fiancé David and our unborn child. That loss led me here, to this work, to all of you. It also left me believing that certain dreams were no longer possible for me. I smiled at Sheriff Dawson's son Michael, who stood at the edge of the crowd. Our relationship had developed slowly over the past 2 years, beginning as friendship and deepening into love neither of us had expected to find again. Life had other plans. Michael and I are expecting a baby girl in September. Cheers erupted, with Michael's face breaking into the broad grin that had first drawn me to him, so different from his father's usual serious demeanor. We've decided to name her Elizabeth Hope, I continued when the excitement quieted. Not just to honor Harold and Elizabeth's memory, but because hope is what this community has given back to me. Hope that loss isn't the end of the story, that new beginnings are always possible. I turned to the large covered easel beside me, which brings me to the Trust's new initiative. For 5 years, we've focused on addressing immediate needs: medical bills, educational opportunities, housing crises. Today, we're launching something more forward-looking. I unveiled the architectural rendering of a modern building complex. The Elizabeth Hope Millfield Center for Community Innovation will provide space for local entrepreneurs, artists, and community organizations to develop sustainable solutions to our town's challenges. Unlike traditional development, projects that often benefit outside investors first, the center will be community-owned and operated, with profits reinvested in Millfield. The crowd broke into applause as I explained the details: how the center would create jobs while addressing local needs, how it would prioritize businesses that serve the community rather than extracting from it, how it represented an evolution of Harold's approach to using wealth for community benefit. Harold addressed immediate crises one by one, which was necessary and important, I concluded. But Elizabeth's diary suggests she also envisioned more structural changes to prevent those crises in the first place. The center honors both approaches, continuing Harold's direct assistance while building Elizabeth's vision for a more just community economy. As the formal presentation ended and people dispersed to enjoy the remainder of the gathering, Dr. Hayes approached me again. Elizabeth would have loved this, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This is exactly what she and Harold used to talk about in this very garden: how to use the Millfield resources to create real change, not just charity. I nodded, resting my hand on my growing belly. I've tried to honor them both: Harold's compassionate attention to individual needs and Elizabeth's vision for structural change. And you've honored yourself too, Dr. Hayes observed wisely. You've taken what Harold began and made it your own. That's the true legacy, not just continuing someone else's work, but transforming it through your own understanding and experience. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, I found myself drawn to the lakefront, where the new bench dedicated to Elizabeth and Hope now stood. Michael joined me there, his hand warm around mine. "Happy birthday," he said softly, "and happy new beginning." I leaned against him, watching the community Harold had secretly nurtured for decades, now openly celebrating their connections to each other. Children whose education Harold had funded were now teaching younger children to skip stones on the lake. Businesses he had saved were providing food for the gathering. Families whose medical crises he had alleviated were volunteering with the Trust to help others facing similar challenges. What had begun in tragedy and secrecy had blossomed into something open, collaborative, and forward-looking. The neighbor everyone had ignored had, in death, become the heart around which a renewed community had formed. "I think they would be proud," I said, looking toward the cottage where Harold and Elizabeth had once dreamed of their future. Not just of what we've done with the trust, but of how the town has changed, how we've all changed. Michael nodded, understanding without needing explanation who they were. Everyone in Millfield now lived with these ghosts, not as haunting presences, but as inspiring reminders of both what we had lost and what we could become. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I felt a profound sense of completion. Harold Miller had chosen me, for reasons both rational and mystical, to carry forward a legacy born of his greatest loss. In doing so, he had helped me find healing for my own grief, purpose for my life, and ultimately, a new family to love. The neighbor everyone had ignored had seen me, truly seen me, when I most needed to be seen. And in learning to see him in return, I had discovered how to see everyone around me more clearly, more compassionately. That, perhaps, was Harold's greatest gift to us all, teaching us to truly see each other, in our needs and our possibilities, our struggles and our strengths. To recognize that beneath the surface of every life lies a story of both pain and resilience, waiting to be acknowledged. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit around the gathering, I whispered a thank you to the night, to Harold, to Elizabeth, to baby Hope, and to all the invisible threads that had woven our lives together in ways we were only now beginning to understand. The neighbor everyone had ignored had left behind not just a fortune, but a vision of community that had transformed us all. And in that transformation lay the true wealth he had accumulated over his lifetime, not in dollars, but in lives touched, potential unlocked, and hope restored. That was a legacy worth continuing, worth expanding, worth passing on to the next generation, including the daughter Michael and I would welcome in a few months, who would grow up knowing the full story of the quiet janitor whose secret life had changed everything. In the end, Harold Miller's greatest achievement wasn't the millions he gave away, or the crises he averted. It was teaching an entire town that the most valuable thing we possess isn't wealth or status, but our capacity to truly see each other and respond with compassion to what we find. That lesson, lived in secret by one man for decades, had finally emerged into the light, where it could grow into something even more powerful, a community that continued his work not from the shadows, but together, openly, with full hearts and clear eyes, for generations to come.